When the first trailer for the second season of Andor was released, something about it seemed odd. Instead of using music from the first season of the show, or music from the wider Star Wars library, or even just generic orchestral trailer music, the Andor trailer was scored with Steve Earle's 2004 song, The Revolution Starts Now. And this seemed to be off-putting to some people. Music from our world doesn't belong next to the Star Wars universe. The story world of Star Wars is such a distinct and real place that most commercials and trailers do their best to maintain the feeling of that world through the music. And when they don't, it feels noticeably off. And the integrity of the Star Wars setting as a real place with a real history and real vibes is something that goes back to the very beginning. Because Star Wars isn't just a movie. Star Wars is a documentary. The seeds were planted in the 1960s when George Lucas was attending film school. While he did do a couple of narrative short films, most of his projects were more like strange quasi-documentaries, even when the class didn't really call for it. Look at Life is a 1-minute short film Lucas made for an animation class in 1965, but it doesn't really have any animation and is instead a montage of photographs illustrating contemporary social issues. 14208 is an 8-minute-long visual tone poem about a race car doing laps around a track. The Emperor is a short documentary about a popular Los Angeles disc jockey. 6/18/67 was filmed during the making of the movie McKenna's Gold and is another non-narrative tone poem that's more about the location the movie was filmed in than the movie itself. Lucas's last project before tackling a narrative feature film of his own was Filmmaker, a 32-minute documentary about the making of Francis Ford Coppola's 1969 film The Rain People. From his earliest student work, George Lucas demonstrated a clear interest in just observing reality, looking at life, and that carried forward into his professional career. One of the tricky things about making science fiction movies is making them feel real. So when George Lucas made the science fiction film THX 1138 as his first feature film on a small budget, he had a tough task ahead of him. But because he was a documentarian, he found a hook and designed the movie as if it were an artifact from the future, a documentary that had somehow found its way back in time to the 20th century. So things like ambient, naturalistic lighting and an emphasis on the mundane aspects of a futuristic society were offset by incredibly stylized compositions and unexplained societal rules that all blended together to create something that seemed real, but not familiar. Lucas's follow-up movie, American Graffiti, had a similar sort of documentary feel, though it was set in 1962 rather than the far future, and instead of the still, sterile world of THX, Graffiti embraced a looser and messier feeling, with the cast being allowed to ad-lib their dialogue, and bloopers even made their way into the final cut of the film. After Graffiti, Lucas then began working on Star Wars, and his continued focus on giving the worlds of his movies an underlying documentary reality continued there too. The mundane futurism of THX 1138 evolved into the signature used universe look of the galaxy far, far away, and Lucas got American Graffiti's co-writers to punch up his script, helping Luke Skywalker and Han Solo feel as realistic and relatable as Steve Bollender and Kurt Henderson. Other elements were added to reinforce the documentary idea as well. George Lucas was enamored with the films of Akira Kurosawa, and one of the things he liked about them was that he was able to follow the human story of the characters, even though the culture those stories took place in was completely unfamiliar to him. So he decided to do the same thing with Star Wars. The characters don't stop to explain how a hyperdrive works or what a binary load lifter is, because everyone in the movie already knows that stuff. The audience only gets a crash course in the Jedi and the Force because Luke himself is unfamiliar with them. Even the way the movie was made helped to reinforce the idea that this wasn't just a movie about another galaxy, it was a movie from another galaxy. For one thing, the film does a lot to make us see the characters as the characters rather than the actors. The iconic text crawl that opened the film replaced a more traditional opening credit sequence that you might see in another movie, leaving the identities of the actors and film crew out of the audience's mind until the story was over. When Lucas repeated this for The Empire Strikes Back, he was even fined by the Directors Guild of America for not including opening credits, and he ended up quitting the guild entirely. But even when the movie finally gets to the credits at the end, it might not matter that much, because rather than casting distractingly famous movie stars, the characters in Star Wars were embodied by largely unknown actors who the audience would see as the characters first and the actors second. Beyond the characters, the structure of the movie also helps to sell the universe of Star Wars as a real place. As the channel So Uncivilized points out in one of their videos, Star Wars has a very clear, very linear storytelling structure. This helps to guide the audience through an unfamiliar story and world, but it also subtly reinforces that the story is real. Rather than arbitrarily cutting away from the action to introduce a new character, the audience is bound to a hypothetical documentary film crew that's following the action. We start out following R2-D2 and C-3PO, some rebels run by, so a part of the film crew breaks off to follow them. The crew that's with R2 then introduces us to Princess Leia, and the crew following the rebels allows us to meet Darth Vader, with the stories branching out from there. This means that even though he's the protagonist, Luke Skywalker doesn't show up until 15 minutes into the movie, because before that point, the camera crew documenting the events of the film doesn't even know he exists. And this has continued throughout the first 6 Star Wars movies, with most characters not being shown on screen before they're encountered by someone who's already got a camera crew following them. And the idea of these movies being filmed by a real camera crew also means there's very little impossible filmmaking in the original movies. Before the special effects were done, the Star Wars of Star Wars were represented by documentary footage of aerial battles from World War II, with the movie replicating a lot of those real-world shots. Even with the digital technology available during the prequels, the films stay away from impossible camera moves and even add the kinds of zooms and shakes that would be found in footage of a real documentary crew covering a hectic battle. We also aren't able to go inside the characters' heads and see their thoughts. When Luke or Anakin have visions of their loved ones in trouble, we don't actually see those visions because there's no way for a documentary crew to film them. Well, most of the time. In Revenge of the Sith, we actually do see a premonition Anakin has about Padme's death, one that was added during post-production because the movie needed to beef up his motivation for falling to the dark side. And in Attack of the Clones, we meet Zam and Jango before anyone else does, even though the identity of the Queen's assassin is supposed to be a mystery. And this is just due to the requirements of the story. Making sure character motivations or plot points are being communicated clearly is way more important than strictly adhering to certain self-imposed stylistic limitations. Because while realism helps, it's not the most important part of a movie, and it's not the most important part of Star Wars, because Star Wars is a documentary, but it's also a fairy tale. Star Wars is a mythology of knights and wizards and princesses and pirates, where good and evil are as fundamental to the existence of their universe as gravity is to ours. So while the documentary trappings helped Star Wars feel real, it's still mythology, it's still fake. The opening text crawls are the science fiction version of Disney's storybook openings, and they're stylized to resemble the opening crawls from Flash Gordon's serials, numbered in a way that makes you feel like you missed part of the story somewhere. Right from the beginning, the film is telling you, this is just a story, it's not real. And even within the meta-mythology of the Star Wars saga, the movies aren't objective depictions of historical events. The storybook opening crawls are part of a larger compendium that George Lucas calls the Journal of the Whills, and the events of the films were told to the Whills by R2-D2 a century after the story ended, to the best of his recollection, and of course that means he always makes himself the hero. This tension of documentary and fairy tale, of the movie telling you the story is fake and then doing everything it can to convince you it's real, is a big part of the identity of Star Wars as a whole, and it's created an interesting spectrum for those movies to be in the middle of. And because there's a lot of room between the extremes of documentary and fairy tale, over the decades, different fans and creators have often ended up on very different points of that spectrum. The RPG sourcebooks created by West End Games in the 80s and 90s did a lot to flesh out the Star Wars universe from the documentary perspective, expanding on different planets and alien species and things like the logistics of the Empire and the Rebellion, which makes sense. The fairy tale part of Star Wars comes from the actual playing of the game. Early expanded universe authors drew heavily from these books as well, and in-universe guidebooks have been prolific in the 21st century, even making sure certain facial expressions are correctly categorized. Wikipedia, the fan-made wiki that follows in the footsteps of those sourcebooks, leans almost entirely towards documentary as well. Its articles are written from an in-universe perspective, as if the people and events it describes are as real as those mentioned in any earthly encyclopedia. Wikipedia does include real-world and behind-the-scenes information, but it relegates that all to the bottom of the page. It takes about 45,000 words before the article about Han Solo tells you that he's played by Harrison Ford. Then there's some official Star Wars projects that have almost no documentary at all. 1997's Shadows of the Empire was a test run for the upcoming prequels and included all the tie-ins you'd expect from a Star Wars movie, just without the movie. It had a novelization, a video game, comic books, toys, even a soundtrack, because the merchandise is a part of the fairy tale aspect of Star Wars. After you see the movie as a kid, you go out and have your own adventures, imagining what else could happen in a galaxy far, far away. Some of the kids who did that are filmmakers like J.J. Abrams and Rian Johnson, who lean much more towards the fairy tale side of Star Wars. Their movies understand that they're fake stories being watched by an audience of people who grew up watching other fake stories decades earlier. So rather than being an objective viewer, their cameras are subjective, showing scenes from a specific character's point of view, or participating in flashback sequences that take place inside the characters' heads. They also include story decisions that are specifically designed to interact with the audience. Rian Johnson's infamous subverting expectations meme makes the conversation between the storyteller and the audience a part of the experience of watching the movie, which is appropriate because his movie deals heavily with the stories that people tell each other and the consequences of how those stories are told. Finn lets Rose believe a certain story about himself. Luke and Kylo both tell Rey different stories about their conflict. Rey herself has to let go of the stories she's told herself about where she came from in order to move forward with her life. Luke Skywalker even stops being a flesh and blood person so that he can become a mythological character. J.J. Abrams also leaned more into Star Wars as a fictional fairy tale, even comparing Rey to Cinderella in his director commentary for The Force Awakens. During that same scene, he also mentions that her discovery of the lightsaber in the box is something that's meaningless to her, but is included because it means something to the audience watching the movie. And his Star Wars films are full of things like that. Callbacks and references that acknowledge the history of Star Wars as a series of movies, but not really as the history of a real place. On the other hand, Tony Gilroy, the showrunner of Andor, is much more focused on the documentary side of Star Wars. His show does use things like flashbacks and doesn't bind itself to a literal physical camera crew the way the Lucas movies did, but like Wikipedia, Andor treats the history and people of the Star Wars galaxy as if they're as real as the history and people of our own. It's not a fairy tale, it's a period piece. Mon Mothma's concern about the Gorman people in the first season is a reference to a massacre that was first mentioned in an RPG sourcebook printed in 1990. How she reacted to that event was depicted in an episode of Star Wars Rebels in 2017. Both of those sources are treated as real historical events, so Andor's not inventing a new story to tell. It's telling the story that already exists and is implied by the history of the universe. Even the Force, the most fairy tale adjacent thing in Star Wars that also exists in its universe, takes a back seat to the actions of the everyday people who live there. And ironically, the show leaning so hard into documentary might be what opened the door for it to use a real song from 2004 in its advertising. Because the music of Star Wars is a part of the audience-facing fairy tale. When Luke is burning his retinas looking out into the suns of Tatooine, John Williams and the London Symphony Orchestra aren't hanging out off to the side. When Luke is marching out to receive his medal at the end of the movie, the music that's playing is for us. When a trailer uses a recognizable theme from Star Wars, that's purely because we, the audience, have an emotional connection to that part of the storytelling. So when Andor treats the Star Wars universe as a real place with a real history, it knows that there's a clear separation between the observer and the observed, between the story written in the journal and the people reading it, and that music lies on our side of that wall. And when you get down to it, there's really no difference between a trailer using a composition from Earthling songwriter Steve Earle or a composition from Earthling composer John Williams. Both of them are completely foreign to the Star Wars galaxy, but one feels more like it belongs. Andor is certainly a great show, but one of the things that I've seen a lot of people say about it is that it doesn't feel like Star Wars. And while the sequel movies certainly did their best to feel like Star Wars, they were movies about Star Wars rather than being movies from the Star Wars galaxy. So if you're ever experiencing a new Star Wars story somewhere down the road and it feels off or weird in a way that you can't really explain, maybe it's leaning too far towards either documentary or fairy tale and isn't striking the right balance for you. And I think that for you is important. The balance and tension on the spectrum between documentary and fairy tale that those original stories struck is very difficult to replicate, and most Star Wars stories aren't trying to. Star Wars has been around for decades, with different eras of stories and creators, and fans who all bring their own preferences to their corner of George Lucas's sandbox. None of them are necessarily wrong, but maybe we're all just on a different part of the spectrum.
Now.